one, go.
Go. Okay, wait, what the hell? You paused too much before the go. Try to keep it at
Jesus.
the same pace.
I was trying to build a climax. Okay. 3,
Two,
2,
one,
1,
go.
go.
All right, perfect.
All right. Welcome to the second edition of Two Persians, One Rice Cooker. My name is Sina, and next to me is my co-host, Bayan Frutan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. How are you?
Great, all things considered. And speaking of those things to be considered, the last time we had an edition of this podcast, there wasn't a global health pandemic. And
No, just a
right
murder.
well, in between that podcast and this podcast, it seems like the end of the world is now procuring. So if we have a third edition of this podcast, I'm guessing there's going to be what? Nuclear annihilation? A Holocaust? Correlation equals causation?
It's just gonna be a microphone inside of our grave silently recording our bodies disintegrating.
What does that even sound like? Is that just like maggots slowly devouring our flesh?
Probably, yeah. Just
Ugh. Yeah, that'll certainly bring in some viewers. What a great start.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so how are you doing these days, Ban?
I am doing well. I'm just mostly at home, working from home. And I mean, same with my wife. We've just been home trying to play games at home, doing a puzzle at home, whatever, man, whatever we can do to pass the time.
Nice. Are you also working via remote access to your work computer?
I mean, the thing is that my work is technically always remote in the sense that I always go to client sites. So working from home or working from a client site does have some differences that the client has some paper documents that we would usually get. So now they need to scan it in or stuff like that. But I technically already work remotely all the time anyway in that sense.
Okay. Well, that was a nice tidbit of information. So I guess in terms of me, well, let's just get into it. Corona is probably on everybody's mind, so I guess we could talk about a little bit about where the world is at, where we're at, maybe what the difference is between U.S. quarantine and maybe Israeli quarantine is.
Maybe.
I can tell you right now, Israeli quarantine I don't want to say it's authoritarian, but it's authoritarian.
Okay.
At this point, the quarantine is indefinite, and they also set up several directories, one of which says that we cannot leave 100 meters away from our home via walking.
So what if you need to do essentials like shopping or stuff like that?
Do it with a car.
Oh, okay, I see. You can be further away than 100 meters from your house, but you can't do it walking.
Exactly. Which, for most people, isn't the biggest issue, but for Baha'i staff, particularly younger staff who don't have a temporary license, we basically have to carry grocery bags with us at all times, or the Israeli police could stop us, question us, and if they find our appearance questionable, they could fine us, and if we can't afford the fine, then we're arrested.
Yeah. I don't know what to say to that. I was going to try to make some joke about US taxes, but or student loan payments that even after you're bankrupt, you can't pay them, and so then you have to go to jail, but whatever.
Yeah, well, how about the US then? That's a good segue.
Well, I mean, in the US, it really depends on where you're at in terms of what state you're in, what locality you're in, because everything is very concentrated in that sense. You know, New York City is different from Oklahoma City, is different from LA. So I could speak to Southern California, San Bernardino, LA County, this area. Um,
Mm.
so we do have certain guidelines, but as far as I know, there's not many places where there is actual enforcement of some kind of a law. I mean, businesses did have to shut down, non essential businesses did have to shut down. And for example, restaurants can only do carry out, different things like that. But the thing is that there are some areas where there isn't a curfew, but at least not where I live in Chino Hills currently. But
Mm.
um, like there's you can still go outside, you can still do your thing, but I mean, I think some people that makes it a little bit difficult to have an effective quarantine because there are a lot of people that still go out and do stuff. So some things are prohibited, like gatherings larger than 10, or like I said, non-essential businesses and those kinds of things. But from a there's still people who would like go to each other's houses and have some kind of a party, a social distancing party where they're all going to rub on to each other, but whatever.
Didn't I think New York released some guidelines on social distancing coitus recently?
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know why I segued there, but it just came to mind.
Well, I mean, New York is hit pretty badly from all of this.
I think New York is probably one of the worst in the entire country as it stands. The last I checked, they have around 30,000 or so cases and a few hundred deaths at this rate.
Yeah.
In fact, people in New York are leaving at mass, and when they do leave, they basically get quarantined by neighboring states and cities immediately and are put into isolation.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And Andrew Cuomo is doing everything he can as governor, as far as I understand. Like, he's requesting ventilators, ICU beds, and FEMA is apparently in very short supply. So I think within the course of the next 5 days, the medical capacity of the US is going to be overwhelmed. But that's just hearsay. Don't take my word at it. Follow the likes of Dr. Fauci or Dr. Burke. They come out with much more reliable data than I ever can.
Yeah. Well, actually, California had an interesting law passed, which was that apparently hotels can kind of be made into makeshift hospitals in the sense that they just take over hotels essentially and just make the rooms into rooms to host sick people, and that they can use that instead if they start running out of ICUs and hospital beds in general. um so that, I think, was kind of a good move because hospitals are struggling anyway, won't really have much clientele to begin with, so at least like this they'll be getting some kind of a money and at the same time doing something that could possibly save lives. So
Right. Well, you probably would know better than me. How would they make up the costs? Are they depending on that federal stimulus package that just passed in the House and Senate? Because I think there was like $500 billion allocated to big business and then $300 billion to smaller businesses.
yeah, something like that. I mean, I'm sure airlines, hotels might be part of this, but I meant more so that, I mean, these hotels would be compensated for hosting these sick people and being a temporary, almost like a hospital, I guess, in a sense, but just not really a hospital. But I'm saying each patient that will stay there will get a certain amount of money for being hosted by the hotel, even though it is enforced, but at least they'll be compensated to a degree.
No, but I'm saying who's going to compensate them?
Well, you know what? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm assuming it's some kind of a subsidized thing from the California government that they would take over that cost, unless maybe the hospitals that charge for the care, or the healthcare provider that charges for the care would then pass on some of that charge to the hotels, maybe. I don't know, actually. That's a good question.
Well, it makes sense because, from my understanding, California is actually one of the not one of the few states, but one of the states that has a surplus in their state reserve.
Yeah.
So I think, especially knowing California's economy, they probably could make up the costs. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, they better, when we pay like 150% gas tax, and and you have to drive everywhere. You have like 20 million people living here driving every single day.
Right. And they always want to showcase that that tax money is being put to good use in road construction, but then road construction causes traffic, so nobody's happy.
Yeah, and the roads still have more holes in them than some third world country back dirt road.
Yeah, I'm trying. What's the worst highway in California right now? I remember CA 57 used to have a lot of bumps, but they also had a lot of trucks. Um, what's the worst paved highway as it stands?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
They're all relatively well managed. It's usually those street roads
Yeah.
that are relatively terrible, particularly around cities for some reason.
Yep. Yeah, no, the just the normal streets are the ones that are really bad.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't think most people want to hear about road construction or. John Oliver had this really good bit recently, actually, where he wanted, you know, he usually has like these segments that are very niche that most people don't really think about.
Yeah.
Like, let's say, equity charges on mobile homes. Like,
Okay.
this is something that most people are not interested whatsoever, and he manages to make it interesting. But after
Yeah.
Corona spread out, he's like, "Well, what am I supposed to do? While everybody is staying home at quarantine, do anybody want to hear? Does anybody want to hear about Warren Buffett and mobile home charges?"
Probably.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, I would certainly listen to it anyways.
Yeah. But what was his
Yeah.
point?
His point was that he had to drastically shift the topic that he was going to discuss and research extensively for into the coronavirus. He had two segments on the coronavirus because it just became this massive international topic, and he felt that he would be irresponsible if he didn't talk about the coronavirus and decided to talk about another niche topic.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not gonna question the man's integrity because I don't know what his true intentions are, but it could also very well have been that almost everyone is hyper focused on coronavirus. So if you're not covering coronavirus, you're not getting any viewership.
I mean, isn't that the story of Trump coverage over the course of the past 3 to 4 years? Like, especially during and right after the election, if you don't cover Trump, then your viewership numbers go down.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of, well, yeah, I mean, in terms of John Oliver's integrity, I don't think it could ever be questioned after the Bob Murray skit that he did. Have you seen the Bob Murray skits?
No, I don't. I don't know. I don't even know what you're referring to.
Oh. So Bob Murray is this like nefarious oil baron, and John Oliver did a segment on like oil in America, and particularly how this individual Bob Murray was just terrible to his workers. One time there was like this massive accident, and he started berating and screaming at the victims' families.
Whoa.
So after John Oliver did that segment, Bob Murray sued him, and John Oliver basically responded by making an entire musical number on how Bob Murray is a complete asshole.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't speak to his integrity, but that does speak to his good sense of humor.
Maybe. I don't know. I think it speaks to both.
Again, I'm not questioning it. I'm just saying I don't know what his motives are, and it could easily also have been fear of losing viewership.
Yeah, possibly. What was fascinating about the musical number is at one point an attorney that was representing HBO came on and was basically saying, "Whoa, John Oliver, you got to stop. This is going to cost us a lot of money." And then he turns around to the camera and then says, "F you, Bob Murray," as well. So,
That's it.
God bless John Oliver.
Yeah.
Anyways, uh, so yeah, it's pretty bad everywhere. There is no effective treatment that is being tested right now. A vaccine is very far off away into the horizon. It's probably not going to come next season either. Yeah, it seems to be bad all around, although I'm not really interested personally in, let's say, uh, what do you call it? The immediate fallout of Corona. I'm much more interested on the economic implications that come from the aftermath of the coronavirus because the fact that the entire global economy has shut down, not just for several weeks, but potentially several months, is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And it's going to wreak so much havoc on global supply chains. I mean, the Dow Jones went up recently because of the stimulus package, but over the course of this entire disaster, it went down. It went from like 26,000 points all the way down to 18,000 points, which is just unheard of.
Well, the thing it's interesting that you bring this up because one thing about economics in general that was always kind of perplexed me is this assumption of a never-ending growth. It's like this indefinite growth assumption when it comes to the economy. For example, you buy a growth stock, not one that necessarily pays out dividends, but one that you're
Mm-hmm.
expecting to increase in value. Now, okay, that's obviously a form of investment and you hope that it pays off over time, etc. But to expect that a company or the industry indefinitely grows and grows and grows so that your stock becomes more valuable is just logically not possible. At some point, something is going to happen internally or externally that will flatten or decrease the value of your stock. That's just how it works. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fact that people are so shocked, oh my God, the downturn in the economy, dude, it's been going up for like the last 13 years has been almost nonstop, incredible bullish market growth. Yeah, there
Mm-hmm.
were some small dips in between, but the general trend was unbelievable. Every year was going higher and higher and higher. And now there was an external influence that decreases it dramatically. And now I'm not trying to diminish the loss of, I don't know, people's pension funds or retirement money. Like, yes, of course, people suffer losses, and I don't wish that upon them. I'm more so just confused about the fact that a lot of times certain or most individuals do not really take into consideration the risk that runs with these kinds of stocks, which is that you need to understand that because it is such a risky investment that at some point in time something is going to happen that will decrease the value. So,
Mm-hmm.
this is now, this time it's the coronavirus. Next time it's the CFO of some company, having done something fraudulent. The next time it's, I don't know, some stupid crisis again. So these things shouldn't come. I mean, they might come at a surprise in the sense of no one anticipated the coronavirus, but it shouldn't come as a surprise that the economy and in large, the global economy, the local economy, whatever you want to use as a scale, at some point is going to hit a form of recession.
Right. In fact, many market experts have been predicting this because conventional wisdom has it that almost every decade or so, there's going to be a dip in the economy that most likely leads to the recession. And I think a lot of people were speculating as to when the next big global recession was going to happen and when they should pull out their stocks. Because we had the 2008 housing crisis. And the fact that nothing has happened since then is borderline miraculous. But yeah, eventually these things, eventually these things happen, yes, but I guess no market expert could have predicted a global pandemic that just simply shut down everything, even though it should have been in the books. I'm not sure.
Yeah, obviously not. I mean, again, no one could have anticipated this in that sense. I was more so trying to say that this philosophy of a never-ending growing industry and market in general, that your stocks just keep on increasing in value over time nonstop. I'm saying that is there's a clear fallacy in there, which is that at some point things are exhausted. At some point something is going to happen to decrease that value. At some point things are going to normalize. I'm just saying that idea that your stocks keep on increasing in value is just one that doesn't logically work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess. I guess where I'm going is like, when does the economy get so bad that your stocks essentially become worthless securities?
That's a good question. I don't think it will get to that point. There's always going to be financial instruments and that portion of the economy that is related to equity transactions and buying other businesses or parts of businesses and funding businesses and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's going to go away, but that kind of reminds me of One Piece, where towards the beginning, one of the characters, Sanji, he is with this cook and they're stranded on this rock somewhere, and they had two, bags full. One was full of food, the other one was full of gold and silver and jewels and that kind of stuff. And as they're there, the cook, he kind of pretended that so the one with the jewels and stuff was much larger, and he pretended that he's taking that one, while Sanji, who was a kid, takes the smaller one full of food. And anyway, they're stranded and they keep on eating, and they're like separated to be on the lookout for a ship to come pick them up. And eventually they run out of food. And then it's just the irony of, you have all this valuable stuff in that bag, your jewels, your gold, your silver. But at the end of the day, that cannot feed your stomach. You know what I mean? And I feel like that speaks volumes to what we're going through now. In a sense, we are completely dependent, especially here in the US in large. I mean, not everyone, but most people in the US are completely dependent upon external parties. Someone needs to give us food, someone needs to give us water, someone needs to give us shelter, someone needs to give us clothes. We are not able to take care of ourselves to almost any degree whatsoever. Some can, but most can't. And when that is the case, and it's in the face of something like what's going on right now, then at some point, now I hope it won't get to that point, but at some point it's possible that money doesn't even really hold that much value anymore, because that person who has some food is probably would rather eat food than have money in the bank. What's good? What is all that money good for if you're just going to starve to death, right? So I think one thing that this has brought me, like in regards to planning for the future is I was thinking, damn, I really need to somehow learn to to be able to take care of myself so that I am to a degree self-sufficient and am not so reliable to the people around me that in the worst case scenario, I would literally just starve to death because I couldn't take care of myself, or, if the water stops running, that all of a sudden I don't have any water anymore and I would, die from thirst. It's just crazy.
There's actually that sort of dependency on external parties. I think there's a sort of Darwinian concept that you could extract from that. There's this concept called evolutionary mismatch. And what this relates to is evolutionary traits which at one point in time were advantageous, but because of changing ecosystems, eventually they become maladaptive. And in the case of human beings, we go through this something called anthropogenic change, which are essentially human-caused environmental changes. So at one point we were a rural-based society, and then eventually we cultivated cities, and then eventually we became industrialized, and that is a form of anthropogenic change. And in the case of evolutionary mismatch, one thing that's fascinating, particularly in the case of Western culture, is the idea that we're completely dependent on external parties, or else we just simply won't function. And there's a bit of a dichotomy that goes on there, because on the one hand, there are a certain group of individuals that are completely idle to this sort of lifestyle, or they're completely, what's the term? Fine with this lifestyle of just being completely dependent on others. But then there are others who derive all their sense of meaning from labor. And you could say that there are almost relics of a past generation where, for example, in the case of the coal industry, where so many workers are being laid off on the basis that clean energy is the way of the future, and that maybe that form of low-skill labor is just going to eventually be given way to automation.
Learn to code.
Learn to code, both to coal workers and journalists.
Yeah, exactly.
But, what are your thoughts on that, though? There's just the idea that in this particular time and age, like the anthropogenic changes that we're going through, this idea of independent self-preservation seems to be more and more of a relic of the past. Do you think there is something inherently Darwinian about that?
I do think so, because, if you think about the Darwinian of survival of the fittest in the sense, right? Fitness in the sense that you can adapt yourself. When you have a society where, the one thing that I was thinking about is just the way that our society functions is so unrecognizably different from how it was even in the recent past 100, 200 years ago, that we are so highly specialized that we don't really have the capacity to, on top of it, be able and learn how to take care of ourselves. Think about the amount of time that we spend going to school, learning, working, all that kind of stuff. And that's okay, right? Like, that's how our society functions right now at this point in time. This is how we work as human beings. But what that results in is that we now I'm an accountant, and I do that 8 to 9 to 10 to 12 hours a day, 5 times a week. That doesn't leave a lot of time to learn how to farm. And that results in now I have a highly specialized skill, but at the same time, that becomes useless if our society stops functioning the way it does, which it could get to that point. And so I was able to adapt and do something that under the current circumstances are valuable to me and help me thrive. But it is so circumstantial that if something changes, such as all of a sudden grocery stores don't sell food anymore, now all of a sudden my accounting skills become completely worthless, and now I will not be able to properly survive with that anymore.
I think that's an incredibly valid point. Just the idea that, I mean, not only are our skills so specialized, but the jobs or roles that are played are so demanding that we can't do anything beyond those specialized set of skills that we were given.
Yeah.
And in terms of, like, for example, like self-preservation physiologically, like the only people who can really take care of their bodies, let's say, are the people who make a living off of they're the people who make a living off of body image.
No, they depend just as much as we do. It would be someone who has farmland. You know, it's the guy who lives in some rural area and has some cattle and some chicken and some goats and, you know, a little bit of crop growing and some like lettuce growing in the backyard. Like, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, what I was referring to was more along the lines of like just taking care of one's body in the form of like exercise or healthy dieting. I'm saying the people who maximize on that are the people who make a living off of, let's say, body image. So that's like another specialized skill set, but I guess it's not a survival set.
Yeah.
Or a survival skill.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because I feel like we're naturally segueing into kind of the philosophy realm almost, because, for example, there's the agrarian philosophy, which is essentially that pretty much that there is like, maybe philosophy is not the right word, but the agrarian, you know, way of life, which is that the fact that people should have lands on which they can do some type of agriculture and use that in order to be self-sufficient. So there is an actual, let's say, way of life called after that. And so I don't think it will gain traction, but I think that's something worth looking into nowadays, where it's like, damn, you know, you go to the grocery store and a lot of things are out. You know, what are you going to eat now? Well,
Yeah.
you know, you can use this as an opportunity to prepare for the future, where now you can say, hey, maybe I should be able to have something in place so that at least for a certain period of time, I'm able to live off of my own land, so to speak. Now, that's difficult for a lot of people who live in cities because they only have an apartment, but as best as you can, you know?
Bayan, could you imagine the day where completely agrarian countries become the global economic leaders of the world off the basis of necessity?
Yeah.
Like, if you look at countries like Liberia or Somalia, where most of the percentage of GDP that comes from that country is agriculture, they're essentially agrarian societies. So what would happen if the global markets tanked so far down that the value of paper money just dwindles to the point of nothing, and then we look to countries like Somalia and Liberia in terms of future models that humanity could survive off of?
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point, which is that there are certain societies that are removed from this economic reality of highly specialized labor, you know, living in cities, not having land, not having crop, not having anything to be self-sustainable. And, you know, it's weird because we look at some of these societies and we label them uncivilized, you know, like, oh,
Right.
these backwards villages where, you know, they don't even have any kind of schooling there, and they all just live in this village and this and that. Yes, okay, I understand there's an aspect of our current civilization that is obviously beneficial to this society in large, but at the same time, these people are so far removed from this type of lifestyle that in the case where there's some kind of a downfall of that kind of society, such as what we're talking about right now, they are the ones who are able to move past that, and a lot of us won't.
Right. In
So
fact,
yeah, you're right.
yeah, it's interesting because I think this notion of specialized labor, but beyond specialized labor, let's say your monetary worth or net worth, how that seems to have been superimposed globally, and that metric or that economic model seems to have like gained some level of, what's the term I'm looking for? It seems like the world seems to look up on the capitalist model of specialized labor and paper money being the most valuable possession that you could attain and the best form of bartering. I think that method of that particular economic model was man, I am like dwindling on words right now. But basically, what I wanted to say was that there's this anthropologist named Jason Hickel that extensively goes over the flaws of our current system and talks about like the benefits of agrarian societies who that existed before colonialism came along and then basically uprooted these cultures from the ground up and basically reprioritized reprioritized the values that a lot of these cultures upheld. So many of these countries had like bartering systems initially, but eventually capitalist models were superimposed on them, and I mean, on the one hand, again, there are certain benefits like the overall lifespan has increased tremendously, and things like the net worth of each individual or just their median income has increased significantly. But he's saying that, like, let's say if we're looking at it from a happiness index, these cultures were happier before colonialists uprooted their cultures or something along those lines. So I guess what I'm trying to come at with that word salad that I just laid out is that I think it would be valuable to look upon models, other models in which humanity could garner some level, not just happiness, but man, I feel like I'm just spouting out words. But what I'm trying to say is, it would be valuable if there are other models that we looked upon in the future, because as you said, there is no such thing as constant growth. Eventually, the curve will flatten, and we have to think about what do we do then, and maybe looking at these other models that have been established in other civilizations can help us cultivate something new and better.
Yeah, it's weird because we use that, what I'm hearing, the underlying message behind what you're saying, which I absolutely agree with, is the concept of a form of insurance, let's call it, right? Or something where you are, as the saying goes, not putting all of your eggs in one basket. When we become highly specialized, skilled workers, laborers, whatever you would want to call it, we are foregoing the capacity and the opportunity to learn how to do other things as well, because we are so hyper focused on one particular thing that we are not putting ourselves in the position to be successful if that one particular thing ends up becoming obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
in a sense, we it's just that we need to find a balance, right? I don't think the solution is now, well, let's uproot our society and all specialized skills should cease to exist and we should all go back to farming, but rather that we should all be balanced to a degree that we not only our time and energy and knowledge and learning should not only that we should invest that into learning how to be self-sufficient, learning how to take care of ourselves, but also our resources, both in a micro and in a macro sense. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, if I were the governor of California, I would think that I would essentially want to have something in place that if for whatever reason import is not an option anymore, you can't import anything anymore, do we have enough in place within our border, let's call that our society, right, without the reliance on external parties to survive as a people? If the answer is no, then we need to start investing land, resources, capital into making sure that that failsafe is there. Because completely relying on an external party comes with several risks. First of all, you are dependent upon their benevolence. Because what if all of a sudden, like right now, society starts falling apart and they're like, hey, no, we need to take care of ourselves. We can't sell you anything anymore. Okay. We rely on their ability and their desire to make these kinds of transactions with us. And as soon as we do that, we run the risk that something can happen where they don't want to do that anymore. We run the risk of becoming obsolete. OPEC countries. At some point, oil is not going to be more valuable than grain. So then people might, or that's not the best example because you still would need oil to run cars, and it's still essential in that sense to, heat, I don't know, to have some kind of a stove running, if you have natural gas. Okay, maybe there's an argument to be made there. But if you're exporting, I don't know, man, t-shirts, that's probably not necessarily going to be the best thing. Dye for clothes or whatever it is. You need to think about, what do we have in place to survive if someone doesn't want to buy or dye anymore? If someone doesn't want to sell us their grain anymore?
Right. Well, I think we've effectively covered many of the technical fallacies associated with our current system. But one thing that I actually wanted to delve into was the macro psychological diagnosis for people who live within these modernized, westernized countries. And let's say, what is our predisposition compared to other societies? And one thing that's always been very peculiar to me was, although we are a much richer country, although we have a higher net worth, or although people have a higher net worth and median salary than most people across the world, one of the most perplexing facts to most sociologists of present and past is the fact that even with all this wealth, the suicide rate is just mind-bogglingly high compared to other countries across the globe. And there have been several individuals across time that have been trying to diagnose this particular issue as to why is it that within Western countries with all this affluence around us, that people feel the need to essentially kill themselves. Whereas within other countries where the circumstances for each individual is so dire, let's say, or less affluent, do they feel the need to just keep plowing along? So before I delve into this any further, do you have any initial thoughts?
I do have some, yeah. I think one thing that contributes to this is this sense of loneliness, abandonment, because if you live in LA and you're in a city of millions of people, in one city, it becomes hard to stand out in any kind of a significant way. When you are suicidal, now, okay, there's a component of mental illness involved, right? But essentially, whether you want it or not, you're in a position where you require assistance. You require external intervention. You require someone to help you back up onto your feet, to be there for you, to guide you. That is hard to see when people need that kind of assistance, when they're just one of millions. It's like trying to find one pixel on your screen right now. You could never do that. One pixel is way too small. And I think people just get lost in the cracks. They fall through the cracks because they can't be picked out. But if you're one of 100, it's pretty easy to spot. And so I think one of the reasons why this has been happening increasingly in our society is because places where these metropolitan cities exist, there's just more and more and more and more people going to the same places. And when that happens, you have more people living on top of each other, and they're harder to pick out. And then when there's someone who requires dire assistance, they can't be noticed because there's already 5 million other people living there.
Right. Yeah, there was I told you about some time ago, like in a personal talk. There's a sociologist named Emily Durkheim who I've been really fascinated with, and some of the things that she talk about are some of the diagnoses that he gives. Like, one thing that you said, which is particularly true, is this idea that, like, I mean, if we're essentially like living in an ant colony, and we're just like this small worker ant that is part of this larger cog of a machine. But unlike ants, us human beings are conscious. We have individuality. And as a result of that, our needs extend beyond the basic medial labor that's required of us. So he jots out individualism as one thing that leads to macro unhappiness in industrialized society. This idea that, yeah, you're an individual, you have your own thoughts, you have your own beliefs, but then suddenly what's interesting is that although you're given all these freedoms as an individual, freedom of thoughts, freedom to choose what you want to buy, it's this idea of overchoice, or this idea that an individual has to make every single life decision for himself, that ultimately ends up being debilitating or crippling. Because suddenly, every single life decision that you make, it's no longer the responsibility of the family, it's no longer the responsibility of the tribe. That responsibility falls on you and you alone. If you succeed, you reap the benefits. If you do not succeed, you reap all the fallout. It is not thrust upon anybody else except yourself. And it's interesting because, like, for these particular individuals, even if other people try to act as a social safety net, as like a pillar of support, they still can't help but have this element of self-hatred, that everything that's wrong with me, or that's wrong that happened in my life, is because of me, and no amount of social support can change that. And that's an attribute that's in many ways exclusive to individualism.
Yeah.
So things like that, or this idea of excessive hope and too much freedom. These are like all critical points that Emily Durkheim outlines in I forget the name of the book, but in one of several books that he's written. One thing that he actually mentioned, which I was fascinated in, was the idea of the weakening of nation and family. So in the case of the family units, there's like this whole massive historical timeline that you could go over where family was essentially one of the pillars of religion, particularly Catholicism. But then over time, Protestantism, or Calvinism more particularly, came into being, and suddenly family was looked upon as a selfish decree, or it was looked upon as a selfish creed, in that if you have a family, you're going to let the needs of the family overtake the needs of the community. And as a result, more time should be put into community life as opposed to family life. And somehow, that particular mindset was transmitted to many nations at the time. So, like, many industrialized societies eventually took up that model. And it became less about the family and it became more about the state. It became more about nationalistic identity. Now, I mean, at this point in time, this seems far removed from reality because like everywhere you go, it's anti-nationalism. But back then, it was all about nationalism. I mean, you look at World War One. You look at, the whole origin point of World War One was the killing of Archduke Ferdinand by this organization called the Young Bosnians, who basically wanted the free country of Serbia / Yugoslavia. Their entire creed was around having a nation to themselves and building an identity for themselves. And the idea of these sort of nationalistic aspirations eventually declined when faith in these parental institutions wavered. So it's like, let's say in the case of the United States, it was the Vietnam War. It was our involvement in Vietnam. It was the Nixon scandal. The instant all these scandals hit the federal government, most people lost faith in their parental institutions. The big problem of today is that we threw away the baby without the bathwater, in that we did not, although we threw all these things away, this idea of family, this idea of nation, we didn't have anything else to buttress that with. And then suddenly people no longer have an identity that they could reside in to a certain extent. I mean, when you look at, let's say, the far left movement of today, it's very much anti-nationalism. It's very much everything about it is just they adopt things like postmodernism, intersectionality, anti-nationalism to a certain extent, or the nationalism of today. And the problem with all of it is when you put it all together, it's just very much full of contradictions. And it's largely because the very things they're against, they also kind of work in tangent with that philosophy. So it's like, okay, anti-nationalism because the U.S. is racist, but then at the same time, let's build a coalition of all these. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? To a certain extent?
Of course. It's like, let's get rid of all laws because they were built by corrupt white men, but let's make laws so that, hairstyle that is, historically relevant to a race becomes protected under, labor laws. It's like,
right, exactly.
You're trying to undermine the institution, but then use that institution at the same time for your own benefit.
Exactly. And like another example would be like, we're against fascism, but at the same time, we are very much for building up the capacity of the federal government to take over all spheres of public life.
Yeah.
So it's what's interesting right now is that we're living in a time where everyone has lost faith in certain ideologies. They have lost faith in this idea of family. So, for example, they don't, well, not family exactly, but let's say the heterosexual model of family. Except many of these people who champion against it also, have heterosexual families of their own to a certain extent. Or the point that I'm trying to make is that through all these anarchic beliefs that these certain factions of today try to build, they're in some way they're tethered to these movements that they themselves hate to a certain extent because they can't imagine a way of life without those institutions. So I think the biggest problem of today is that everything is just too confusing. We can't wrap our head around what we want and what we don't want.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge part of it, that life has become so complex. But I don't, I think it's more so at the same time that we also try to defer everything. Like we don't really want to hold the key to our own happiness in that sense. I'm trying to phrase this the right way. It's like most of the time, in a micro and macro sense, if you ask someone whether they're happy or not, they might say yes or no. And a lot of times when people do say no, it is because of some external force. Oh, I live in a corrupt system. Oh, my family abandoned me. Oh, this or that happened. I got robbed when I was 5 and I was traumatized. This happened, that happened. It's like we have deferred the responsibility of our own well-being to external parties, and now we are free from that responsibility. We're not responsible for that. Someone corrupted us. Someone made us horrible. It is not my fault, right? And I think a lot of times that type of attitude is fostered within children too, of like, you are great the way you are. If something doesn't work out, it's not really your fault. You're perfect. Don't even worry about it. And I think that also contributes to a lot of things that are going on today that are negative, which are that there's a lack of an instillment of personal responsibility. I hope I don't sound too much like Jordan Peterson. But in that sense, it's like, why, for example, would the far left want to have an authoritarian figure dictate what people can and cannot say? It's because at that point you defer the responsibility to someone else. The reason I'm not happy is because someone called me a fag. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to make the word fag illegal so that they cannot say that anymore, and then I can be happy. As long as they can say that, I cannot be happy. And I think that attitude of my happiness is dependent upon the people around me, how they behave and interact with me, is true to a degree, right? Like, if we go through the pyramid of needs and someone locks you in a cell and you can't go outside and you don't get enough food and your family got murdered, okay, it's hard to be happy in that situation. There, the external force is so extreme that you cannot even live properly anymore. But another person calling you a word, for example, is not the kind of force that doesn't allow you to live properly anymore. You can still go do your own thing and live your own life just as you would if they wouldn't call you that. But somehow you defer that to them and say, I cannot be happy as long as they call me that. And I think that is just one example of many things that would fall into that type of a category. I cannot be happy as long as I need to pay taxes that I don't want to pay because they're forcing me to do something I don't want to do. Okay, but this line of thinking is one that leads to an ultimate demise, because you do not think you're capable of doing anything to make yourself better. And so then you are just waiting for someone else to do it, or trying to force someone else to do it. And that just won't happen.
Yeah. I mean, there's quite a bit to mull over with relation to what you said. I mean, Well, to go on a small tangent though, did you hear about like Jordan Peterson's current circumstances?
Mm-mm.
He is he currently had a paradoxical reaction to an anti-anxiety medication called benzodiazepine, and he he was hospitalized and had like this incredibly severe reaction, and he was put into a rehabilitation center, and now he's basically comatose and in a Russian hospital.
What does that mean? He's what in a Russian hospital?
He's being hospitalized in a Russian hospital, apparently because he couldn't be provided the proper medical care in the United States, so he went to Russia.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was just like this far off article that I read like a month ago, but I just thought, oh, how the mighty have fallen.
Yeah.
But no, with relation to what you were saying previously about this idea of, I mean, this again, this codependency and the fact that our entire happiness is derived off of our emotional condition, whether negative or positive, is completely dependent on external parties. I mean, there was a psychological concept like that we went over in lifespan development. I think it was external locus of control and internal locus of control.
Yeah.
Where if internal locus of control is when you start internalizing all your problems and blame yourself for everything, or opposite of that, you every single victory that you have, you feel is of your own making to a certain extent. And then external locus of control is essentially the opposite of that. That external parties have led to either your unhappiness or your happiness. And it's interesting how American society has sort of fostered that on a macro level, particularly the external locus of control, that model of being, where suddenly it's like in terms of we were talking about the economics of that recently, or just a few minutes ago, where we were talking about how in terms of lifestyle in terms of like physical labor, we're completely dependent on external parties. And the idea that we let go of our independent faculties and let other people or institutions basically dictate how we should feel, I think is a really, really terrifying prospect. And the fact that it wasn't like there's nothing controlling our minds. This was of our own making. The fact that there are so many people out there with this fragility complex where, I mean, the example that you gave, like somebody using a derogatory name. I mean, ultimately, this is an artificial construction, because what's happening is either this individual is typing down words, it's not posing any physical harm to you, or he's saying it to your face, and essentially all you're receiving are reverberations from the air. Whether he's saying something kind to you or negative, it's the same reverberation. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
These are all artificial constructions, and yet we somehow allow them not just to seep in and let them overtake our entire mental well-being, but we start enacting policy. I mean, we start enacting policy and letting these powerful entities dictate what should be said and what shouldn't be said based off of nothing more than interactions.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and I think what you said is correct, that much of this is fostered within children. I mean, I think Jonathan Haidt had an interesting bit. He talks about this need for parents to build something called anti-fragility, that in order for children to develop independently and in order for them to foster skills that will help them throughout the course of their lifetime, they need to experience some semblance of hardship during their childhood.
Yeah, of course.
Whether that comes in the form of, like, Jonathan Haidt, for example, what he does is he lets his 7-year-old walk to the grocery store by himself, which is I think 7 minutes away from his own house, and it's in a very safe neighborhood, so he isn't too worried about his kids. But what it does is that it fosters trust between the parent and the child. But then two, it also fosters this sense of independence where it's like, well, the 7-year-old now knows how to look at prices. He knows how to go to the cashier. He knows how much to give. He knows to ask for change. He's fostering these skills that ultimately, over the course of a lifetime, he's going to use and rely on, and he just has an early head start.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think now I haven't lived in Europe for quite a while, and I don't want to overgeneralize for all of Europe, but when I lived in Switzerland, that was actually relatively common in that sense. I think, for example, when I grew up, almost every single kid, not every single kid, but almost every single kid went to school all by themselves. You have like 7, 8-year-olds just getting out of the house, taking the bus, coming to school, and it works out just fine. Kids come to school every single day. They're pretty much on time every single day. And you build on that responsibility, bit by bit. Then all of a sudden, I was like, 8 years old, and I would go to school, and then I would go to soccer practice on my own, and then I would go home. And it's like, it's not, kids of that age are able to do more than what we give them credit to, And I think that's a very good point and an important point, that you gradually expose them to different things that could possibly put them in a kind of risk, right? I mean, it shouldn't be an undue risk. Don't drop them in the middle of a war zone, but send them to the grocery store. It's not that big of a deal. Have them walk to school. It's a 10-minute walk. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, John, because like that psychologist Jonathan Haidt that I mentioned, he tries to diagnose the origin of the fragility complex that's happening within our generation. Like, why is it that parents suddenly felt the need to suddenly thrust their kids into their home and always accompany them wherever they go? Like, where was this newfound terror in terms of taking care of your kid and keeping a watchful eye on them at all times? And he diagnosed it, I think, all the way back to the 1980s, saying something that local media was being very callous with how much it broadcasted stories relating to child abductions. So it was on every single headline. These local news channels would start talking about child abductions, the investigations that would go on afterwards, the people that were involved in child abductions, and suddenly this created this massive fright amongst parents across the United States, and that led to things like eventually recess was cut from school permanently, or the fact that when kids are in parks they have to be accompanied by parents, or the fact that kids can't go, they have to maintain like a certain radius around their house, and if they cross that radius then they're going to be in trouble to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Like there's yeah, and what was I gonna say? Well, I was building up to a point. Yeah, I mean, like stories like Stand By Me. Have you ever heard of Stand By Me?
No.
It's a Stephen King book that chronicles like 4 kids traveling the countryside, and eventually they stumble upon a dead body and have to figure out what to do with it. And I thought to myself, like, man, like the 21st century version of that will be 4 kids traveling with their mother, accompanied by like daycare residents, and eventually a police car will stop them and say, why aren't there 2 parents accompanying these kids?
And then they get arrested.
And then they get arrested, exactly. And then they get fined, and then suddenly that kid is sent to a foster home because the mother was negligent.
Yeah, yeah. No, man. But
No, well, oh, sorry.
yeah.
I wanted to finish this point,
Yeah, go
though,
ahead.
that I wanted to say that what was interesting about like this what do you call it? This oversaturation of child abduction stories in the media was so overplayed because it was only in the few dozens across the country, and yet it was a nationally syndicated story that played out for weeks. I mean, the Amber Alert, for example. And I mean, that shifted our entire culture with relation to how we rear our children.
Yeah.
And it's scary because we're also living at a time where even if you want to foster some semblance of independence with relation to your child, there are external entities that might prohibit you from doing so.
Yeah, that's true.
So it could be in the form of other parents calling you out, or it could be in the form of, let's say, a police officer that calls you out on the basis of negligence. Like if a kid is by himself, the police officer might say, "Why aren't your parents here?" And then they will accompany them home and do something. So it's like, what was scary about today is that not only are parents independently enacting like this fragility style of parenting to all their kids, which is eventually going to foster a culture of complacency all over, but it's that even parents who want to act independently of that and foster skills into their kids that will help them throughout their lifetime might be negated from doing so because our culture mandates a sort of fragility style of parenting, and if you don't abide by it, then you could be in trouble. Hell, you might even lose your kid in the future, so it's kind of scary.
Yeah. You know, the thing that is very perplexing to me is like what you said, it's just to such an extreme. It has become that it's not about taking some kind of a reasonable precaution, that something that you're trying to avoid something. It's that you're completely trying to eliminate a risk that to begin with is extremely remote, right? The amount of child abductions, I don't know the math behind it, right? But I mean, one thing I'm certain of is that if you were to take, every child that has been abducted in the last 10 years and divide that by the total children that there are in this country, that it would be so small of a fraction that it would not even come to like 0.1%, right? So to shape our lives completely around a possibility that is so remote that you couldn't even round it up to a percentage point is something that is just very hard for me to stomach. It's like things should be based on you're more likely to die in a car crash. Like, why are you driving? Well, I need to drive.
Yeah.
Okay, they need to learn to grow up a certain way. We can't say, well, I'm willing to accept this risk that is much more likely to result in physical harm and danger and accident and death, but something that is extremely remote, no, I'm not willing to take that risk. It's kind of just backwards to me, And the other thing is, it's just to such an extreme. It's not anymore about let's try to avoid extreme harms at all cost, right? An abduction, a murder. It's like you can't come. For example, my sister, when I will never forget this. It was towards the beginning when I moved here, and she was going to this primary school, and she was in, I don't know, like 3rd grade or something, 4th grade, 5th grade. I don't remember exactly what grade. And then my stepmom, she was telling me about the rules they have there. No open-toed shoes, no running on pavement, no sports, no contact sports, no this, no that. It's like, what can these kids do? Why can they not wear open-toed shoes? Are you telling me that wearing sandals is now such a risk because they might stub their toe? Like, give me a break. They can't run on pavement. Why? Because they might scrape their knee? Like, give me a break.
Right.
And it's not, it's to such an extreme that it's just not reasonable anymore.
I don't think I know a time when it was ever reasonable. I mean, in the cases of schools, I don't think they respond. Like, most schools wouldn't respond in the case of child abductions because most districts don't have to deal with child abductions. What I think most schools are worried about is the potential parent which will file a lawsuit against the school for their kid playing dodgeball and scraping his knee on the pavement.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I don't really blame these schools anymore. I blame the parents that are constantly, like, thinking, that are constantly portraying their child as this darling angel that can't be hurt, that can't experience a semblance of hardship. And if they do, these parents are going to counteract and essentially mandate all these new rules via a PSA meeting.
That's true to a degree. I would say yes, definitely parents have. I think it's a combination of three entities, or organizations might not be the right word. Three entities coming together and making this happen. One is overprotective parents. The other is schools letting themselves being bullied and being scared of potential litigation. And the third is, as a society, we have decided to give parents this kind of a power, you know? If the parents would not have this kind of a power that has been bestowed upon them in a macro sense from our society, from our laws, to say, yes, you know what? If your child scrapes his or her knee in school, you have the right to sue them. You have that right. Okay, we all have the right to sue anyone we want to, so I guess that's not something we should take away. But then that litigation is taken seriously, that litigation has resulted in guilty verdicts. That is where, as a society, we have failed. Because it's the same thing as with giving the government too much power. Once the government has too much power, it's very hard to take it away. Same thing with individuals.
Right.
Once we give parents the power to dictate what everyone at school can and cannot do just because they're scared of their child stubbing a toe and maybe, having a little bit of blood trickling from their foot, now all of a sudden we gave them that power to dictate what everyone can and cannot do at school. And so I
Right.
think it's also on us in large that we give them that kind of a power and we say you do have the authority to make these kinds of decisions for everyone.
I have an analogy for you. Do you think that overbearing, overprotective parents are the flat earthers of parents?
Can you elaborate?
Well, in that being overprotective of their children essentially does the very opposite of what they intended to do for their children over the course of their lifespan.
But where does the flat earth analogy come in? Like, where's the relationship between those two?
I don't know, both lead to stupid results.
Sure. I mean, thank goodness there's no policies and laws and regulations being made around flat earthers. It's more like,
Oh, just you wait.
yeah,
Just you wait. You might have just jinxed that entire you might have just jinxed that entire thing. Like, next thing you know, we're going to start our next podcast and broadcast that there's been a new federal agency that has been set up strictly for the Flat Earth Society.
yeah. And then from now on, when you're not allowed to teach geography in school anymore, and you need to give equal time to flat Earth.
In fact, when you have astronomy, you can no longer use, actual globes. You have to use slides or a whiteboard or just a board to portray the Earth, because then it's an accurate portrait of what Earth looks like, flat.
Exactly.
Man, what a dramatic pause. I thought you were going to call me out.
No? You know, I don't know if that's too hard of a segue into something else completely, but I think it kind of relates in a certain degree, which is that, you know, I feel like recently I've started to become an ultimate skeptic in the sense that
Ooh.
the only thing that I can confirm beyond any doubt whatsoever, is the fact of my own existence. Now, I cannot talk to the nature of my existence, right? Like, I don't know what I am
Mm-hmm.
exactly, spiritual, physical, numbers inside of a simulation. That part is not something that I can attest to. But the fact of my own existence is something that no one can deny me. I know that I exist
Mm-hmm.
in some capacity, in some way. But that cannot be said about anything that is outside of my own existence. Everything that exists outside of my own existence is an assumption. Now, it's an assumption that allows me to function properly in a society, in to live normally. So I need to make these assumptions, but they're assumptions nonetheless. No one can prove to me that this laptop that is in front of me actually exists. They can prove to me that I can feel it and touch it and see it and that it works as intended and that it does certain things, but no one can prove to me its actual existence. And I feel like sometimes that to me translates into my own life behavior in the sense that things that are outside of my control and outside of my own realm of what's going on in my head does not need to be taken that seriously. You know what I mean? It needs to be taken seriously because it affects us and it's our lives, and we depend on these things functioning properly and doing as we intend them to, and we need to make these assumptions to live. But at the end of the day, I don't want to go too far out in an existential sense, but at the end of the day, when we die, are any of these things truly going to matter? When we die and we have no idea what's going to happen, and it could be a void, it could be an afterlife, it could be, reliving the same life again as a snail, whatever it is, we cannot
Mm.
attest to the existence of anything outside of ourselves. So now the question becomes, why do we put so much importance? Why do we sometimes put more importance onto things to which we cannot attest to the actual existence of that thing than ourselves, whom we know beyond any doubt whatsoever is an actual thing, actually exists? Same thing as
So,
with these parents. Like, they give so much importance to this institution of school teaching their child whether, some person was born at some point in time and taught some kind of a thing to some people and claimed to be the leader of some religion, more than they do on their own life, in a sense.
I'm going to respond to that, but can I safely assert that you are a proponent of metaphysical solipsism?
I don't even know what that means, so maybe, but I don't know.
Dude, these skeptic positions that you're defining is the exact definition of metaphysical solipsism. You know, here, okay, let me just pull up the definition right now. I'm going to read it to you, and you need to look it up because it's exactly what you're talking. Oh, here it is. Okay. Metaphysical solipsism maintains that the self is the only existing reality and that all other realities, including the external world and other persons, are representations of that self and have no independent existence.
I'm almost that, because I don't say that they don't have an independent existence. I'm merely saying that we cannot prove that independent existence the same way that to ourselves we can prove our own existence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can
Mm-hmm.
prove your own existence to yourself beyond any doubt whatsoever, but you cannot prove to me your own existence beyond any doubt whatsoever to me. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
So it's more that
I
I'm
see what
not
you're saying.
denying the existence of other things, but more
Yeah, you're not
so,
denying the
yeah,
existence of independent reality. You're just saying that we can't prove it on the basis that, I mean, reality is perceived only through our lens, and as a result, can we really prove anything with relation to existence outside of our own through the very limited opticals that we have?
no.
What?
I said no, you cannot.
God. Oh, okay. I thought I was about to yell. Damn it! I thought you were gonna say no. That's not what I
Oh,
meant.
no, that is pretty much what I meant.
Okay, perfect.
It's weird to me because this has happened a bunch of times now in our personal conversations where I say something that I thought I came up with on my own, but it's actually something someone else already said quite a while ago, and I just happened to come to the same conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look. I'm sorry, Bayan, but there is no such thing as an original idea in this day and age. Everything that you surmise, somebody else has already thought of in some capacity.
Yeah, I guess.
You might as well accept that fact. Every time you think of something novel, do yourself a favor and look it up.
Yeah, I should.
But in response to what you're saying, I mean, I more or less agree with that substantiation. Not substantiation. I more or less agree with that point with relation to just look. I mean, I know. Well, I can't know, like you said, but it's not like I'm saying that there isn't an independent existence beyond our own, but I just can't prove it.
Yeah.
But to address your question, which was to say, like, why do people place so much value on things that, you know, ultimately in the grand scheme of things might very well be meaningless? That was your question, correct?
Yeah, meaningless to the degree that we don't even know whether they actually exist or not.
Right. Okay. Well, to answer your question, I'm going to refer to a French existential philosopher by the name of Albert Camus. Have you ever heard of him?
Heard of him? Do not know enough about him or his positions.
Okay, well, he basically posits the same, well, he doesn't posit the same thing that you do, but he basically explains, you know, what if, what if we live in a future where there is no afterlife? What if we know that for an absolute fact and people base their entire existence off the idea off the very predication that there is no afterlife once we die? What do we do? He says there are three possibilities. One, we could simply commit suicide. Two, we can basically go about our daily medial functions like nothing has happened. Or two, we could essentially embrace the absurdity of the non-existence of life and the fact that every single action that we undertake ultimately has little value. And we could just embrace that absurd reality. And I'm actually trying to jog my memory. Because he didn't advocate for anarchy or like breaking societal norms or rules, but he basically just said like laugh at this idea of non-existence and simply move on with your lives, but at the same time keep in mind that there is no ultimate goal in your life, and as opposed to finding despair in it, just laugh at the absurdity of your existence or something along those lines. And that's the position that I'm personally taking, which is that, if ultimately none of this means anything, then I'm just simply going to laugh at it. That's my diagnosis.
Yeah.
That's my personal take. But as far as what other people, like, if I'm going to steel man other people's position, you refer to One Piece. Let me refer to Attack on Titan for a second.
Go ahead.
Uh, there was this one sequence which I freaking love, and I'm not gonna give away anything, but basically, like, our heroes are put into this incredibly hopeless situation, and they have to basically perform this suicidal act in order to win this incredibly harrowing battle. And the leader of this group basically tries to rally them to commit this charge, but then many of the group members ask something like, well, if we're going to die, then whether we die committing mutiny or whether we die charging at this unstoppable enemy, what difference does it make? And he basically says, no, there is no difference. I mean, it doesn't matter if you were born highborn, lowborn. It doesn't matter how blessed or non-blessed your life was. Ultimately, it's all the same if you die by a bunch of rocks being hurled at you. So what gives life meaning? Why do we keep fighting on? Well, it's because we believe in the living, that after our sacrifices, the living will continue to build upon the legacy that we in some way left behind. So to all our falling comrades in this case, they died so that we could eventually win this war to a certain extent. And I take that concept and apply it on a macro level. And I think the same applies. I think the reason why so many people care about other people's well-being, or even when they're well aware that, like, I mean, look, there are tons of atheists out there. There are people who don't believe in an afterlife or that there's anything meaningful that comes after life. And I'm sure there are a ton of nihilists out there who have children of their own. But what I'm thinking is that ultimately the legacy that the personalities that these people have inhabited, they want to pass on to their kids or to other people. And that's why they place such importance on these entities or objects or other individuals, because a portion of them now reside within these other individuals. And that's where the added importance comes in.
Yeah, but where would you have that same position if I were to tell you that you as an individual, once you die, even if you have done something amazing and great that affected or saved a lot of people, will eventually be forgotten in the not so distant future, and that your influence and what you did is going to be lost amongst the billions of people that lived alongside you and also did things that helped other people and saved other people, and eventually you can never keep track of billions of people just living and dying all the time, and that's that.
Well, I mean, one, I think that's that position. Now you're a proponent of Neoplatonism.
I'm not a proponent of anything. I'm just kind of challenging you. I'm saying you're saying, well, you find some meaning in the continuance of your legacy, let's say. But I'm saying,
No,
what if?
no, I'm just, yeah. No, I'm just saying that it's funny because all your counter positions are actual, like, they're either metaphysical positions or philosophical positions that so many thinkers from the past have taken up, and I always find it funny that you just unconsciously refer to them, even without knowing that it's been authored by other people already. So
I'm
your
just a
mind's in the right
plagiarist.
place. Sorry,
I said I'm just a plagiarist.
we're all plagiarists, though, man. But well, it actually, I mean, there's this great movie that I saw recently which leans on this one, I think, sub philosophy called hauntology. And I'm sorry that I'm just dropping all these terms right now without actually giving reference to them, but it very much deals with the same thing that you're talking about, which is this idea that, I mean, ultimately over the course of several billion years, or maybe even millions of years, or just maybe even several centuries, like, the memory of humanity will just completely vanquish, and then there's just going to be nothing left. And after that point, what does it all matter what sort of legacy that you left behind? And how I will challenge it is, and this is this is the position of like, well, hubris, or what's the term for it? The positive element of ignorance. But ultimately, people, I think people have these. There's a term that was given. It was a term by Jordan Peterson that I actually liked. We have these things in our head called a priority structures, where ultimately there are some people in the world, particularly the philosophical type, or like the people who like to dabble in metaphysics, who ultimately ponder these big questions that ultimately none of us have answers to. So really, this question that you bring up, I really can't answer it, because ultimately you're right. Humanity will probably be vanquished. It will probably be wiped out, and there will be no memory of us left to conceive. We're probably right on that level. But in terms of how do we live through it, like how does somebody, when somebody ponders these things, how does somebody, how does somebody not grasp, what's the word, not grasp it, how does somebody like, how does somebody contemplate something of such existential magnitude? And what I would say is that people just don't. They have these things called a priority structures in their head, where they simply prioritize the things that are immediate in their lives and focus solely on that, as opposed to like as opposed to focusing on the grand mysteries of the universe. Like, again, like your stepmother probably mostly thinks about taking care of her kids, or weekly yoga class, or what to watch on Netflix every evening. These big philosophical questions, they're things that you could dabble in, that even if you talk to them now and bring these topics up, they'll probably talk about it in a conversation. But it's not something that will like, it's not something that will, what's the term? It's not something that will satiate in their minds for their entire lifetime. In fact, it's something that will probably be forgotten about the next day in their heads, because in their minds they have these a priority structures. They have these things that they immediately need to grasp, and they don't have time to think about anything else. So I think it's that idea of filling your life with things that are meaningful to you but might be useless in the grand scheme of the universe, that ultimately gets people through this idea of existence and the lack of meaning behind existence. I think it's just the idea that people don't really think about it, and when it's brought up, they still don't think about it.
Yeah, I fortunately and unfortunately do not fall under that category of people. Sometimes it's almost a little bit debilitating, honestly, because I'm like stuck in life and I'm thinking about life, and then I'm like, what the hell does all of this even matter? You know, when I think too existentially about my own existence and my death and my life and all of that, it's almost debilitating, because I think about the ultimate outcome, where it is inevitable that at some given point in time all of humanity will cease to exist. There will be no such thing as humanity. Every single human being will be dead at some point in time, and humanity as we know it on this planet, any other planet in this universe, will not exist anymore. That time will inevitably come. Now, to me, that makes me wonder about the existence of things, the meaning of things. I'm also thinking about it in the sense of, we have this huge disconnect between our mind and our body. Our mind seeks to be infinite. I think that's why a lot of times we come up with, maybe come up with might be a little bit antagonizing, but that's why it is so appealing to us, let me say it like that, to believe in religion, to believe in afterlife, to believe in uploading our consciousness into a computer and living there for the rest of eternity, believe in some kind of a universal, depository where we will just be conscious in there for the rest of time. because our mind cannot ponder non-existence, but at the same time, we're stuck inside of a body that we know will perish. There is no human being of sound mind who thinks about their body as it currently is and is convinced of the fact that this body as it currently is will not at some point perish. And when that happens, our brain will perish too. And as far as we know, our mind is contingent upon the brain. Even if there is an afterlife, it is not one as it is now, because our brain ceases to exist and our entire reality is based on our brain and how it interprets things. So now for me, kind of the thing that is so interesting to me is that this sometimes makes me feel almost disconnected from my body, because it's like I'm stuck inside this thing that I know will fail me. And my mind is desperately trying to find some kind of a solution to be free of this body in some way, fashion, or form so that it can continue once this body will perish. But any continuance of my mind after the body perishes is only fancies. It is only things I believe in. It is only things I want to be the case. It is not anything that I can actually tangibly understand. It is not anything that I can understand beyond a belief and a desire. And I don't know, sometimes that just kind of messes with me in that sense, like when I think about it in this existential way, we're stuck inside this body that will perish and we have no idea what that means for our mind, what that means for our consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I really can't answer any of that.
Yeah, no one can, but that's
Nobody
just how
can. I
it
mean,
is.
this is one of the great philosophical quandaries that has plagued the entire that's plagued the entire field for so long. Everybody's been trying to answer this question. Everybody has their own diagnosis. It works for some people. It doesn't work for other people. It's something that has debilitated so many people for countless eons. And in your case, I mean, ultimately, it is treatable on a person-to-person basis in that, like, it's great to have these thoughts. Like, personally, I love thinking about these things all the time, but it's never debilitating for me. It doesn't really mess me up at all. Maybe because I don't really think too much about the future and I think about now and I think about, like, just how cool these ideas are and I disconnect them from my own reality. But I know that for some people that's not possible. So in your case, I mean, I don't have an answer and I don't have a treatment for you. But at the same time, I do have a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that I think these disquieting feelings that you're experiencing with relation to, this idea of not being able to comprehend non-existence, I predict that the instant that you have a kid in the future, that these feelings will go away.
Maybe. But
that's my hypothesis.
That child will be part of that external reality that I cannot confirm the same way that I can confirm my own.
No, I understand that. Like the philosophical quandary doesn't change. But I'm saying that your priorities do. So while that idea might still be intact, I think your mind will be elsewhere for the most part.
No, everything, I mean, maybe. I don't want to deny it. It's in the future. It's absolutely possible. So I agree with you. Yes, it is possible that could change everything. But the thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked with these kinds of philosophical quandaries, with that kind of a perspective, is that almost everything has benefits and almost everything has, negative aspects to it too. This knowledge, see, when you know something, it's hard to undo that knowledge, and that knowledge affects us, right? For example, if I were to tell you that your dad is not actually your dad and he just adopted you, that's not the case, but imagine if I gave you that information and it was true, then you could never undo that knowledge. You can maybe work around it and say, well, he's still my father because he raised me and he loves me and he took care of me. But you can never now again go back to the time where you thought that he was your biological father. Now you have a knowledge that will forever going forward change your perspective on something specific. And that can never be undone. Knowledge can never be undone unless you have a memory problem or something that you forget. Okay, fair enough. But I'm saying as
Right.
long as you know, you know.
No, I agree with that perspective. I believe that once knowledge is there, it cannot be undone. But I think the way that we interpret that knowledge, or the way that knowledge emotionally affects us, I think it evolves throughout time. In fact, I think that time is the ultimate killer. It kills everything. And while for example, like the example that you gave, that what if I figured out my biological dad wasn't in fact my dad? Well, I could tell you that there are several stages of emotion that I would go through. One would be like shock, I mean, it's the five stages of emotional grief, like shock, denial, anger, something else, and then acceptance, something along those lines.
Mm.
And that could take, for some people it could take a year or 2 years, 5 years. For some people it could take 20 years or 30 years. But I think over the course of somebody's lifetime, for most people, some people maybe this is an affliction that could last permanently because there's so much variance with how we react to certain things. But I think for most people, ultimately these things wane with time and we tread back to some semblance of normalcy because ultimately our although there are some instances of dramatic flair in our lives, ultimately most people's lives are trivial, mundane, medial, redundant, and that I think that redundancy kills any sense of heightened emotions that we might feel in the immediacy of that moment. So that, which is what I'm saying with you. I'm saying that although those thoughts, that knowledge will forever stay with you, I think the way you respond to it over the course of time is going to change dramatically.
That I agree with 100%. And that's actually something else that I was going to say when I said there's negatives and positives. One of the positives that I have been experiencing in this sense is that sometimes I can cherish things to a degree that I was not able to do in the past. Because when I think about it, sometimes I, like I'm with my wife and I kiss her. And sometimes I think to myself that this kiss, or a kiss from her in general, is something that I could, at one point in time, never do again. When she dies, or when I die, or both, that can never be done again. And that, in one hand, is something sad, because of course I don't want that to go away. But on the other hand, it also makes me cherish what I currently have so much because I know that at some point it will not be there anymore. And it sometimes allows me to live in the moment in a way that I was not able to do before because the knowledge of this moment never coming back again, the knowledge of possibly not doing something ever again, the knowledge of this at one point ceasing forever and eternity puts me in a position that I want to enjoy this and cherish this and experience this to the fullest of my capacity because I know that at some point I will never be able to do that again. And so I think that, yes, one of the negative aspects is that sometimes I think about life and in the grand scheme of things, it seems so insignificant and so stupid that I don't understand why I'm even alive. On other times, I feel like I'm able to cherish something to a degree that I was not able to do before because I know that after this moment I will not be able to cherish it ever again. Maybe something similar, but never that thing again. And I know
Right.
that at some point in time I will never be able to cherish anything again.
Right. It's interesting. There's not Agatha Christie. I forget the name of the author, but there's a Victorian fictional book that came out, I think, around the same time as Frankenstein called The Picture of Dorian Gray. Not sure if you heard of it.
I haven't.
Well, I mean, it basically talks about what you're talking about, which is the pleasures of an ephemeral life or knowing that things are temporary. And because they're temporary, you just cherish it all the more. The character Dorian Gray is like this rich aristocrat that's also immortal. And throughout the entire book, he basically keeps trying to stimulate himself, either emotionally or physically, because the idea of living forever, essentially, most pleasures eventually become null and void the more and more he indulges in them. So it's like he has to constantly go higher and higher and higher until there's nothing there. And there's a picture in his basement where the more deplorable acts that he performs, that perfect portrait of Dorian Gray eventually becomes this like horrific monster, this horrific fiendish monster that's almost impossible to look at, because that's what Dorian Gray's spirit looks like now, not because he's stuck in this mortal coil that's technically immortal now. And I always thought of that as like a good metaphor for why I never wanted to be immortal. Like, just imagine how miserable that would be. Like, how everything that you cherish now will just come off as obsolete in the future. Because, I mean, I think it's when you're immortal, that when you're immortal, these are when these problems become like fixated on your minds. Like, everything that you're just describing, if you were immortal, you would literally be laying down on your bed pondering these things and then not giving a damn about anybody around you, essentially.
Yeah.
Because everybody is dying around you, everything is ephemeral, old structures give ways to new ones. And I mean, when all is said and done, like, if you live 3 lifetimes ahead of your dead wife, you start thinking to yourself, like, well, what was the point in that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I understand. And another thing is, although I don't personally like to think about it in this way, there's a certain degree of freedom as well to death, which is that you're washed free of all of your sins and guilt and everything in that sense. Because if you're immortal, the longer you live, the more mistakes you make, right? That's inevitable.
Yeah.
It's in our human nature to make mistakes. We're not perfect, no matter how long we're alive for. And the more mistakes we make, the more things are on our conscience and the more we need to live with it. And if you're immortal, then you're going to live with those mistakes for the rest of eternity. Whereas when you're mortal, you're washed free of that in one way or another when you die, unless you believe in, some kind of a hellish afterlife where if you sin, then you're going to be stuck in hell for the rest of eternity. Okay, good luck to you. But I'm saying, generally speaking, you're washed free of your sins in the sense that when you die, you don't really, in that sense, I mean, again, okay, I guess it depends, but at least the way I look at it is there's a certain liberation in death. When I'm reading, I'm almost done with The Wheel of Time. I'm on the second to last book, but there's a
Jesus.
running theme throughout the book, which is duty, and that's apparently from an Eastern philosophy. So what Robert Jordan did throughout these books is that he took a bunch of different, tales, myths, stories from different cultures and incorporated them into one huge story. For example, there's a lot of, like Celtic myths and lores that he used to make this story. And actually, when I was reading Neil Gaiman's, Celtic myths that he translated over, a lot of the stories were kind of like, oh, shoot, he took this from this story and that from that story. And anyway, there is a quote in the story that is, duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. And I think it's this philosophy that also drives me in a lot of ways, because as long as I'm alive, I shoulder the burdens of life, of responsibility, of doing the best that I can with the little that I have. And even though I understand that in the grand scheme of things, my life is inconsequential, it is not inconsequential to the people around me. It is not inconsequential to me. And so as long as that is the case, I have a duty and responsibility to make sure that I live my life in accordance to values that uplift the people around me and myself, even if at the end of the day it might end up being meaningless. And death is a form of liberation in the sense that you are then free of those kinds of duties. Once you're dead, you cannot be held accountable for anything anymore, because you're not capable of doing anything anymore.
You know what's interesting, Bayan? I think, unbeknownst to you, I think our internal philosophies coalesce more than you think.
How so? What do you mean?
Because, well, for me personally, I've lost the will to live for myself a long time ago, like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And what I mean by that is that although I don't have any issue like suicidal tendencies now, but back in high school, I used to just not care, or I used to be so. I used to think the burden of like making others happy was so high, and that every time I failed, I just was so emotionally distraught that in many cases I was on the verge of suicide. At one point, I almost went through with it, and when I didn't, I confronted my parents, and they were clearly devastated. Like, I'd never seen my father and mother like that at any point, and that reaction, that like primal physical love that they were like portraying at that point, it was so powerful that it just shook me to my core, and then really made me reassess my life priorities, and I basically came up with my own personal life philosophy where essentially if I can't live for myself, then I need to live for others, and as long as others hold value in my life, then I'll keep on living. But the instant that stops, I don't really see a point in going on.
I can sympathize with that, and I understand that. And I guess I want you to know that as long as you're alive, however you're alive, that's better to me than you being dead. So you can always keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah, that's solace. But, yeah. Well, okay, so Bayan, we are reaching the 2-hour mark
we are
already. So I think let's have the final thoughts segment, and then we should call it a day.
Yeah, I agree. I like this one a lot. I think it's a good end right now too. So
yeah, I mean, no better way to end than stories of distraught and suicide. So great. This was a great uplifting segment.
well, I think it's uplifting in the sense that we each were able to find our own meaning to our lives in this huge, I just need to use a bad word right now, in this huge clusterfuck of, meaningless aspects of life. And, even if it's a little bit somber, it is meaningful. I think that is the good conclusion to our conversation.
Right. And I kind of love the direction that it went, where we talked about current topics, then we talked about macro issues, and then we condensed it all the way down to the nitty-gritty micro issues of ourselves.
Yeah.
That's a great little poetic bow tie to a 2-hour podcast that I definitely hope your stepmom watches.
Why?
I want to get her thoughts on this, and like I want her to be so inflamed that she decides to guest star in the next segment, and then she starts fighting you on parenting styles.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, let's stop talking about your stepmom now, because she might actually be an audience member. Anyways, so I guess let's go for cat. Let's go off the incredibly, although substantive, incredibly heavy topics that we just did, and do something light. So, as you said, you're finishing Wheel of Time, right?
Yes,
So,
sir.
is it everything that you hoped it would be? Does it everything thematically tie in perfectly? Does the storytelling remain strong?
Oh, jeez. Dude, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's like from a story perspective, it first of all, so what happened was that Robert Jordan passed after the 11th book, or yes, after the 11th book. The 10th or 11th, I don't remember right now. I think there's 14, so 12, 13. Yeah, okay, so after the 11th book. And um, he had a bunch of notes on how he wanted the story to finish. And so what happened is that this other author by the name of Brandon Sanderson, who actually wrote the Stormlight Archive series, which I also love. I mean, I got a tattoo from that, so I better like it. And he is wrapping up the story really, really well. I mean, he's using all of the plot points that Robert Jordan wanted to use, but he's taking it over really well. It's almost a seamless transition. Like the characters continue to be really, really well fleshed out and developed, and he's true to their character. Now, as for the story, it's just, I mean, even when you were telling me to read a little bit about Carl Jung and, when he's talking about the archetypes, I think I'm really susceptible. I mean, I guess everyone is in that sense, but I'm truly so susceptible to these archetypes and to stories and how those stories represent, a way of life, a kind of philosophy, how a certain philosophy plays out in a fictional character, but in a relatable way, in a way that I look at the story and I can use that as an inspiration for how I would want to live my own life. Not that I would want to live in some, mythical kingdom, but more so the actions that the characters take, their point of view, the way that they interpret a certain kind of philosophy. And the Wheel of Time does that in an absolute magnificent way.
Huh. You know
Truly.
what's funny? What's funny is that I think our not only our tastes in personal philosophy, but also our tastes in storytelling also coalesce quite extensively, because everything that you just highlighted is essentially what I love so deeply about storytelling. So honestly, I think I'm probably going to buy the audiobooks for Wheel of Time and just start listening to them during work, because that sounds excellent. But I guess it's actually similar. I hate that I'm referencing this again, but I just
Attack on Titan. Go ahead. Go ahead.
freaking Attack on Titan, man. It does the exact same thing, where it's like, characters start off a certain way and they have certain aspirations, but then as time passes, as events circulate, and as more is revealed about the grander scope of the world in Attack on Titan, I mean, these caricatures, these archetypes change so dramatically that characters make out of box choices that are like so preposterous initially. And it's like you're thinking, like, you're trying to get into their mindset, like, why would they make a choice like that, or like what is going through their head. And then over time you understand their personal philosophy or their grievances surrounding a certain conflict. And after that point, suddenly something that you think was initially unthinkable becomes the only course of action beat that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it just, stuff like that just blows my mind when author presents an argument that you initially think is unconscionable, but by the end of it, and he circulates exclusively through the character, by the end of it, you're basically siding with this position. It just makes you rethink. It just makes you rethink out things outside of the story. Like, hey, maybe I need to rethink this conflict, or my God, maybe I need to analyze this philosophy, or maybe, nihilism is the way to go. And
Yeah.
I love it when stories do that. So I think we're on the same boat there. I think both of us love incredible character and world building, and when all these themes come together in this beautiful package that's just wrapped perfectly in every conceivable fashion. And honestly, storytelling is the only form of solace that I experience these days.
What does solace mean?
Oh, it's like my only form of joy.
Well, that's a little bit concerning, but I mean, I understand that
No, it
it is
shouldn't.
a
I'm
source of
telling you,
solace.
telling you it shouldn't be, because there are so many great stories out there that I still haven't found that I think it could keep me going for a lifetime.
Oh, for sure.
Like, I mean, I probably haven't told you this. I did tell you this. Like, I'm writing a story as well. I'm working pretty extensively on this screenplay that I'm working on, and one thing that I am trying to deal with is actually something. It's so funny because the things that I'm dealing with in that script are the very same quandaries that you're dealing with on like a afterlife metaphysical note, except it's kind of different. Like what if there was a space in between an afterlife, a place that exists but doesn't exist,
Like a
which is like a
purgatory.
purgatory. It's either purgatory or it's like rehabilitation to a certain extent. And the premise that I came up with is that for you to essentially to move on to the afterlife, you have to relinquish all semblance of your individuality. And within that world, the way to strip individuality is essentially the passage of time. And so I thought of it in the form of relativity, where time changes and distorts depending on where you are. And in this case, because this person is a non-entity or a specter, they essentially don't age, they don't eat, they don't technically exist within this world, but they reside within that world. So what would several lifetimes within that world look like? How would that person's individuality be stripped down bare? And by the time it ends, what's left?
Yeah.
And I just thought it was like a fascinating concept, and I really wanted to delve into it. And just the idea of, I mean, existing but not existing, or like traversing the vast vacuums of space, being not affected by it, but at the same time moving, like you're slowly struggling along or walking in this empty vacuum until maybe you stumble upon a planet or something along those lines. I'm like, my mind is all over the place on this, but unlike you, I don't internalize it. I just think of it on the form of like, man, that's such a cool storytelling note. I really want to explore this.
Well, maybe now you'll do both.
No, I'm definitely not going to do that. After talking to you, you think I want to have that on my mind?
No, you're good.
Yeah. So, Jesus, even when we're talking casually, we have to bring it back to philosophy and death.
I know, man. But excuse me. Either way, I I feel like I really want to read more about Carl Jung, because I've always had a strong attraction to stories, but when what he was saying was so enlightening. So thank you for that suggestion. I think that can hopefully be the next thing we can talk about in our 10 minutes after the podcast.
Dude, we could bring it up during the podcast.
During the podcast.
Why not just talk about the power of storytelling, a Jungian perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just go into the field of depth psychology. Okay, if we're all going over Carl Jung, another person you need to look up is a guy named Joseph Campbell.
Okay.
He is like your prime analytical figure on story structure, and I'm not talking about tutoring on stories, but like really a massive philosophical delve into storytelling. And it's in many respects similar to Jung, but in some ways different. The one thing that I guess on a closing note, the one thing that I've always loved about Jung is is not just the idea of the archetypes, but the idea of the collective unconsciousness.
Yeah.
This idea that these archetypes they exist and depend is irrelevant of culture or ocean. Even if there are civilizations that are remote from one another and don't have any contact, their stories, their mythologies will have those archetypes because tapped into our neural networking, somewhere in our brain, these structures exist and we somehow transmit it from cultures that don't exist respective to one another. And it's just kind of mind-boggling to think like, okay, in the case of Norse mythology, we have the brothers of Loki and Thor, for example, these rivaling brothers. And then in Christian mythology, we have Cain and Abel. And then that mythology, that particular like strand of storytelling, the conflicting brothers, is a tale that's as old as time and extends to so many other cultures that have never come in contact with each other or are centuries apart. And just that idea is always boggling to the mind that no matter how different the culture, in some respects the stories always stay the same, and they're always like different strands of the same story.
Yeah, and thank you for that unconscious correction on your part. Norse mythology, not Celtic mythology. Earlier, when I was referring to Neil Gaiman's book and what they do in The Wheel of Time, they reference Norse mythology, not Celtic mythology.
Well, I was about to say because I read American Gods, which is a Neil Gaiman book, and I know he referred to Norse mythology, but I didn't know he referred to Celtic mythology, and I was about to be impressed because nobody refers to Celtic mythology.
No, Norse mythology.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you're welcome for that subconscious correction.
All right.
All right, man. Well, this was a lot of fun.
Agreed.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for yours.
Hopefully, we're still alive by the time we air the next podcast. But if not, everyone listening, you've been a wonderful audience.
Yes, thank you. The three people.
My closing thoughts is everything is meaningless. I think Bion concurs.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say...
No, we're not starting this.
Okay.
We are not starting this. We're closing right now.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care, you too.